On March 14, 1852, 7 women vanished from a plantation outside Montgomery, Alabama, under circumstances that federal investigators would later describe as disturbing beyond conventional explanation. The man responsible, Elijah Thornyhill, had lived as a hermit for 15 years before purchasing exactly 7 enslaved women at auction, marrying one of them 3 months later and watching the others disappear one by one over the following year. Local records show that authorities received 43 anonymous letters detailing the disappearances, yet no investigation was launched until a federal inspector arrived unannounced in September 1853. What he discovered in Thornhill's ledgers would reveal a pattern so methodical, so precisely calculated, that it suggested years of planning. The truth behind those disappearances remained sealed in federal archives for 78 years. The estate sat 3 miles west of Montgomery's main thoroughfare, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense groves of oak and pine. Locals called it Thornhill Estate, though Elijah Thornyhill himself never used that name. To him, it was simply the property, a tract of 240 acres he had purchased in 1037, with money inherited from a textile business in Charleston. The main house was a modest two-story structure, painted white but grayed by 15 years of neglect, with 6 windows on the upper floor and 4 below, all shuttered even in daylight. Elijah Thornyhill was 47 years old in 1852. A tall man with stooped shoulders and gray threading through dark hair, he wore longer than fashion dictated. His face was weathered, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, and he possessed the distant gaze of someone who had stopped seeing the present moment years ago. He wore the same dark coat in all seasons, its fabric worn thin at the elbows, and boots that had been resoled so many times the leather had lost all shape. Those who remembered him from before 1837 described a different man entirely. Joshua Petton, who operated the general store on Commerce Street, recalled Elijah as gregarious and quick to laugh, a man who attended every social gathering and donated generously to the Methodist Church. He had a wife, Margaret, and 2 daughters. Petton told the federal inspector years later, pretty little girls, maybe 8 and 10 years old. The family lived in a fine house on Court Street, right in the center of town. Then came the fire. The fire occurred on November 3, 1836, a date that appeared repeatedly in Elijah's journals, underlined so many times the paper had torn in places. The official report stated that the blaze started in the kitchen of the Thornhill residence around 2:00 in the morning, spreading rapidly through the wooden structure. By the time neighbors organized a bucket brigade, the entire building was engulfed. Margaret Thornyhill died in her bed on the 2nd floor. The 2 daughters, Emily and Catherine, died in the nursery they shared. Elijah survived because he had been working late in his study, a small structure separate from the main house. But there was more to the story. Details emerged slowly in the weeks following the tragedy. The fire had not been an accident. Investigators found evidence of forced entry through a rear window and traces of lamp oil in patterns inconsistent with normal household use. 3 families of enslaved people belonging to the Caldwell plantation, located adjacent to the Thornhill property, had escaped that same night. The timing was not coincidental. The fire was meant as a diversion, a way to draw attention while the escapees made their way north along routes that were just beginning to form into what would later be called the Underground Railroad. The Caldwell family never forgave the destruction the escape had caused to their neighbors. Neither did several other plantation families who saw the incident as evidence that enslaved people could not be trusted, that abolitionist sentiment creeping south from the northern states was poisoning previously loyal workers. But more than anyone, Elijah Thornyhill never forgave what had been taken from him. He disappeared from Montgomery society immediately after the funeral. He sold his Court Street property for a fraction of its value, purchased the isolated tract west of town, and withdrew completely from public life. For 15 years, he was seen only occasionally, always alone, purchasing supplies in town or conducting cotton business through intermediaries. He employed no one, his fields lay fallow. The few visitors who made their way to his estate reported that he turned them away at the gate, speaking through the bars without opening them. What Elijah did during those 15 years of isolation remained unknown until the federal inspector examined his journals. The pages, written in cramped handwriting that grew increasingly difficult to decipher as the years progressed, revealed an obsession that had consumed every waking hour. He had spent those years researching, documenting, and planning. The journals contained names, dozens of them, organized into family trees that sprawled across multiple pages. Birth dates, marriage records, property transactions, business partnerships, all meticulously noted and cross-referenced. At the center of this web of information were 5 families: the Caldwells, the Harpers, the Suttons, the Bradfords, and the Reynoldses. All were prominent plantation owners in Montgomery County. All had connections, either through business or marriage, to the escape that had resulted in the fire that killed Elijah's family, and all of them had, at various times, owned or employed specific individuals whose names appeared again and again in Elijah's notes, circled and annotated with dates and locations. On February 28, 1852, 15 years and 4 months after the fire that destroyed his family, Elijah Thornyhill emerged from his self-imposed isolation and attended a slave auction in Montgomery. It was the largest auction of the season, with over 60 people being sold to settle the estate of a bankrupt plantation owner from Selma. Elijah arrived early, before most buyers had assembled, and spent 3 hours examining the women available for purchase. According to the auctioneer's records, preserved in the county clerk's office, Elijah purchased 7 women in a single transaction. The purchase price was unusually high, $3,000, more than twice what such a purchase should have cost. The women ranged in age from 19 to 34. Their names, as recorded in the bill of sale, were Hannah, Ruth, Lee, Dinina, Judith, Naomi, and Rebecca. What the auctioneer did not record, but what would later become clear, was that Elijah had not chosen these women randomly. Each of them had a specific connection to the 5 families whose names filled his journals. Hannah had been born on the Caldwell plantation before being sold to the Selma estate. Ruth was the daughter of a woman who had worked in the Harper household. Lee had spent her childhood on the Sutton property. Dinina, Judith, Naomi, and Rebecca each had similar histories, connections to the families that Elijah had been studying for 15 years. The 7 women left the auction in a wagon Elijah had brought for the purpose, and they disappeared behind the gates of Thornhill Estate. For 3 months, nothing unusual was reported. Elijah was seen in town twice, purchasing supplies in quantities that suggested he was finally putting his land to use. Neighbors noted smoke rising from the estate's chimneys regularly, the first time in years that the house appeared occupied. Then on May 19, 1852, Elijah Thornyhill walked into the office of Judge Samuel Wickham and presented a marriage certificate. He had married Hannah, one of the 7 women, in a private ceremony conducted by a circuit preacher who traveled through the area monthly. The marriage was legal, shocking but legal. Alabama law permitted such unions, though they were rare and socially condemned. Judge Wickham filed the certificate without comment, but by that evening, every household in Montgomery's elite circles was discussing the scandal. A plantation owner marrying an enslaved woman was not unprecedented, but it was deeply transgressive, especially for a man of Elijah's former social standing. The Methodist Church, which he had not attended in 15 years, sent a delegation to speak with him. He refused to see them. Former business associates crossed the street to avoid greeting him. Even those who might have sympathized with his long isolation now viewed him with suspicion and disgust. but Elijah showed no sign of caring about public opinion. He and Hannah were seen together twice in town over the summer, walking side by side, an arrangement that violated every social norm of the era. Hannah was described by witnesses as tall and quiet, with features that suggested intelligence and weariness in equal measure. She wore simple dresses, always dark colored, and a bonnet that shaded most of her face. She never spoke in public, at least not where witnesses could report it. What happened to the other 6 women became the subject of intense speculation. They were never seen in town. No one reported hearing them or seeing them working in the fields. The estate remained as isolated as it had been during Elijah's years of solitude, with no signs of the activity that 7 additional residents should have produced. The first letter arrived at the marshal's office on July 2nd, 1852. It was written in careful script on cheap paper, unsigned, and it stated simply, "6 women are being held against their will at the Thornhill estate. They are in danger. Someone must investigate." The marshal, an elderly man named Walter Gaines, read the letter and filed it away. Enslaved people were property, and if Elijah Thornhill chose to keep his property isolated, that was within his legal rights. 2 more letters arrived in August, 3 in September, and 5 in October. Each contained similar accusations, phrased differently but making the same essential claim. The women were prisoners, they were being harmed, and someone needed to intervene. Marshal Gaines ignored all of them. Several prominent citizens, including members of the Caldwell and Harper families, also received anonymous letters. These were more specific, mentioning names and suggesting that the families themselves were somehow responsible for whatever was happening at the Thornhill estate. It was the letter sent to the federal office in Mobile that finally prompted action. That letter, dated November 14, 1852, contained not just accusations but specific details about property law and interstate commerce that suggested the writer had legal knowledge. The letter argued that if Elijah Thornhill was holding people against their will, it constituted a violation of property rights belonging to the original owners, and since the women had been purchased at an estate sale involving bankruptcy and interstate transactions, federal jurisdiction might apply. The argument was thin, barely legal, but it was enough to catch the attention of Inspector Thomas Calloway, a federal agent who had been investigating illegal slave trading operations along the Gulf Coast. Calloway was known for his thoroughness and his willingness to pursue cases that local authorities ignored. He arrived in Montgomery on September 3, 1853, 17 months after Elijah had purchased the 7 women. What Calloway discovered in the following weeks would expose a truth far more disturbing than anyone had imagined, a plan so carefully executed that it had been operating in plain sight while the entire community looked away. Inspector Thomas Calloway was not what Montgomery's establishment expected. He was 31 years old, lean and clean, shaven in an era when most men wore beards, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had learned not to be intimidated by wealth or social position. He had grown up in Philadelphia, the son of a printer, and had joined the Federal Marshal Service at 23, working primarily on cases involving customs fraud and illegal trade. His assignment to investigate slave trading irregularities had come about almost by accident, the result of a case involving fraudulent bills of sale that had crossed state lines. He checked into the Exchange Hotel on Commerce Street, a three-story brick building that served as the center of Montgomery's business district. The proprietor, a thin-faced man named Arnold Hughes, eyed Calloway with barely concealed suspicion. Federal agents were not common visitors to Montgomery, and their presence usually meant trouble for someone. Calloway spent his first 3 days reviewing documents at the county clerk's office. He examined the bill of sale from the February auction, property records for the Thornhill estate, and tax records going back to 1837. He also requested access to court records related to the 1836 fire, a request that raised eyebrows but was granted after Callaway invoked federal authority under the Interstate Commerce Clause. The clerk, a young man named David Patterson, who clearly enjoyed gossip, proved to be a valuable source of information. Mr. Thornyhill was a different man before the fire, Patterson said, leaning across his desk conspiratorially. Owned one of the largest cotton factor businesses in the city, had contracts with plantations all over the state. But after his family died, he just stopped, sold everything, paid off all his debts, and disappeared into that estate. My father tried to visit him once, around 1840, to discuss a business matter. Said Thornhill met him at the gate with a shotgun and told him to leave and never come back. Did anyone ever investigate the fire more thoroughly? Callaway asked. The records suggest it was arson, but I don't see any arrests. Patterson shook his head. Marshal Gaines investigated for about a week, then declared it unsolvable. The enslaved people who escaped that night were never found. They probably made it to free territory, maybe Ohio or Pennsylvania. The Caldwell family pushed for a bigger investigation, but it never happened. I think people just wanted to move on, forget the whole ugly business. Callaway made notes in the small leather journal he carried. What about the women Thornhill purchased? Has anyone seen them? Only Hannah, the one he married, caused a huge scandal when he filed that marriage certificate. Judge Wickham was furious, but the law's the law. As for the others, Patterson lowered his voice further. There have been rumors. Some people claim to hear screaming at night from the estate, but it's far enough from any other houses that it could just be wind or animals. The letters started coming about a month after he brought them home. Anonymous, all of them. Marshal Gaines has a whole file. I'd like to see that file, Callaway said. Marshal Gaines was less cooperative than the clerk. He was 64 years old, had held his position for 30 years, and made it clear that he viewed Callaway's presence as an insult to his authority. I read those letters, Gaines said, sitting behind his desk with his arms crossed. Every single one. They're the work of abolitionists trying to stir up trouble, probably written by the same person, maybe someone who escaped North years ago and wants revenge. The handwriting varies significantly between letters, Callaway pointed out. I counted at least 4 distinct hands. Gaines waved dismissively. They're working together, then. The point is, there's no evidence of any crime. Thornhill bought those women legally. What he does with his property is his business. Even if that property includes people being held against their will, they're slaves, Gaines said flatly. Holding them against their will is the definition of slavery. If you want to change that, talk to Congress, not me. Callaway left the marshal's office with the letters, which Gaines had reluctantly provided after Callaway threatened to return with a federal warrant. Back at the hotel, Callaway spread the letters across his bed and studied them carefully. Patterson had been right about the different handwriting, but there was more. The letters showed knowledge that suggested multiple sources, different perspectives on what was happening at the estate. Some focused on concerns for the women's safety. Others mentioned specific dates when something had occurred. One letter, dated March 15, 1853, stated, "One of them is gone now, disappeared like she never existed. No one asks questions because no one wants to know." The phrase "like she never existed" caught Callaway's attention. He retrieved the auction records and counted the names. 7 women purchased. Then he checked the property tax assessment for the Thornhill estate from 1853, which included a count of enslaved people on the property for tax purposes. The count was 6. One woman was officially missing from the records, and no one had noticed or cared. Callaway decided it was time to visit the Thornhill estate. The road to the property was worse than he had anticipated, rutted and overgrown, clearly not maintained for regular traffic. His rented horse picked its way carefully through the ruts as oak trees closed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the afternoon sun. The temperature dropped noticeably in the shade, and the air smelled of damp earth and decomposing leaves. The gate appeared after a 20-minute ride, a simple barrier of iron bars set between two brick pillars. It was closed but not locked. Calloway dismounted and pushed it open, the hinges squeaking in protest. The house stood another 100 yards down the path, exactly as described, white paint gone gray, shutters closed, and a general air of abandonment despite the smoke rising from one of the chimneys. As Calloway approached, the front door opened. Elijah Thornyhill stepped out onto the porch, and Calloway's first impression was of a man who had aged far beyond his 48 years. Elijah was gaunt, his dark coat hanging loosely on a frame that had lost considerable weight. His hair was completely gray now, pulled back and tied at the nape of his neck, but his eyes were sharp, focused, and they tracked Calloway's every movement with an intensity that was almost predatory. "Inspector Calloway," Elijah said. His voice was rough, as if from disuse. "I was wondering when you would arrive. You were expecting me. Someone like you eventually. The letters would eventually reach someone who cared enough to investigate. I'm surprised it took this long." "Did you write the letters yourself?" "No." Elijah stopped 3 feet from Calloway. "But I know who did. Several people, actually, each with their own reasons for wanting attention brought to this place. I'd like to see the women you purchased," Calloway said directly. "All 7 of them." Something flickered in Elijah's expression, gone too quickly to identify. "Of course, though I should correct you, there are only 6 women here, plus my wife, Hannah. One of the original 7 died of fever last March. I reported it to the county clerk, but apparently the tax assessment wasn't updated." Calloway made a note. "I'll need to see the death certificate. I don't have one. She was buried on the property. Circuit preachers don't issue death certificates for slaves, Inspector. You know that." It was true, though it was convenient for Elijah's story. "Then I'll need to see where she's buried." "Of course, but first, meet the others. They're working in the back of the house." Elijah led Calloway around the side of the building along a path of packed dirt that showed recent foot traffic. The backyard was larger than Calloway had expected, perhaps an acre of cleared land with several structures, a smokehouse, a root cellar with sloped doors, and a long, low building that might have been servants' quarters. 6 women were visible, 3 working in a vegetable garden near the tree line, 2 carrying water buckets from a well, and 1 hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 posts. They all looked up when Elijah and Calloway appeared, and Calloway saw the same expression on each face: fear. Not the routine weariness that enslaved people showed around white strangers, but acute, immediate fear. One of the women near the well dropped her bucket, water sloshing across the ground. "These are Ruth, Lee, Dinina, Judith, and Naomi," Elijah said, gesturing vaguely toward the women. "And that's Rebecca at the laundry line. My wife Hannah is inside preparing dinner. I'd like to speak with them," Calloway said, "individually if possible." Elijah's expression hardened slightly. "On what grounds?" "Federal investigation into possible violations of property law and interstate commerce regulations." "They're my property, Inspector, legally purchased. I've done nothing illegal." "Then you have nothing to worry about." Calloway kept his voice level. "I just need to verify that the women are here of their own will, or rather, that they're being held according to legal standards." The absurdity of the phrase "their own will" hung in the air between them. Both men knew that enslaved people had no legal will, but the fiction had to be maintained. Elijah considered for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You may speak with them, but I'll be present for the conversations." "That's not acceptable." "Then you'll need a warrant, Inspector, and given that I've committed no crime, I doubt you'll get one from Judge Wickham." He was probably right. Calloway shifted his approach. "Let me speak with your wife, then. Surely you have no objection to me speaking with Hannah." Elijah's jaw tightened, the first real sign of emotion Calloway had seen. "Hannah is my wife. She has nothing to do with your investigation. She's one of the 7 women purchased at auction. Therefore, she's directly relevant." For several seconds, Elijah didn't move. The women in the yard had gone completely still. watching the confrontation with expressions that suggested they understood exactly what was at stake. Then Elijah turned abruptly and walked toward the house. "Come inside, Inspector. You can speak with Hannah in the parlor. 5 minutes, no more." Calloway followed him into the house. The interior was dim, lit only by a few windows where shutters had been partially opened. The furniture was sparse but well made: a settee, 2 chairs, a small table. Everything was meticulously clean but worn, as if it had been in use for decades without replacement. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, a bitter, herbal scent Calloway couldn't identify. Hannah emerged from what must have been the kitchen. She was tall, as the witnesses had described, with dark skin and features that suggested mixed African and indigenous heritage. She wore a simple gray dress with a white collar, and her hair was pulled back beneath a blue headscarf. Her eyes met Calloway's for just a moment before dropping to the floor, a gesture of submission that seemed practiced. "Hannah, this is Inspector Calloway. Elijah said he wants to ask you some questions. You're to answer truthfully." "Yes, sir," Hannah said quietly. Elijah positioned himself near the doorway, close enough to hear every word but far enough to maintain the pretense of privacy. Calloway sat in one of the chairs and gestured for Hannah to take the settee. She sat on the edge of the cushion, hands folded in her lap, posture rigid. "How long have you been here, Hannah?" Calloway asked gently. "Since February of last year, sir." "A year and 7 months. And you married Mr. Thornyhill 3 months after arriving?" "Yes, sir." "Was that your choice?" Hannah's eyes flickered toward Elijah, then back to her hands. "He asked me to marry him, sir. I said yes." "Were you afraid of what might happen if you refused?" Elijah's voice cut across the room. "Inspector, you're leading the witness." Calloway ignored him. "Hannah, are you here against your will? Do you want to leave?" For the first time, Hannah looked directly at him, and what Calloway saw in her eyes was not fear, but something far more complex: exhaustion, resignation, and something that might have been bitter amusement. "I'm a slave, Inspector. I go where I'm told and do what I'm told. My will doesn't enter into it. But you're also Mr. Thornhill's wife. That gives you certain legal protections, doesn't it?" Hannah's voice remained quiet but carried an edge now. "I wasn't aware that marriage changed the color of my skin or the law of this state." Calloway leaned forward. "If something illegal is happening here, I can help, but I need you to tell me the truth." Hannah was silent for a long moment. Then she said, very carefully, "Nothing illegal is happening here, Inspector. Everything Mr. Thornhill has done is within the law. You can verify that yourself." The phrasing was odd, deliberate. Calloway heard what she wasn't saying as clearly as what she was. Legal and moral were not the same thing. "What happened to Rebecca?" Calloway asked suddenly. The seventh woman. Hannah's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened in her lap. "She took sick last March. Fever. She died within a week. We buried her in the woods." "I'd like to see the grave, of course," Elijah said from the doorway, "as I offered earlier. But first, Inspector, your 5 minutes are up." Calloway stood reluctantly. He'd learned something, though he wasn't sure what yet. Hannah's careful wording, the fear on the other women's faces, the single missing woman who had conveniently died of fever, all of it suggested something was deeply wrong at the Thornhill estate. But wrong and illegal were different standards, especially in Alabama in 1853. Elijah led him back outside and across the yard toward the tree line. The 6 women had returned to their work, but Calloway could feel them watching as he passed. None of them spoke or made eye contact. The grave was 100 yards into the woods, marked by a simple wooden cross with no name. The earth was settled, suggesting the burial had occurred months ago, as claimed. Calloway examined the site carefully, but found nothing suspicious. If Rebecca had died of fever and been buried here, this is exactly what it would look like. Satisfied, Elijah asked, not remotely. Calloway said, "But I'll need more evidence before I can proceed." I'll be staying in Montgomery for the foreseeable future. I may return with additional questions. You're welcome anytime, Inspector. As you can see, I have nothing to hide. But as Calloway rode back toward Montgomery, with the afternoon sun slanting through the trees and the sounds of the estate fading behind him, he knew that Elijah Thornyhill was hiding something. The question was what, and whether it was illegal enough to justify federal intervention. The answer would come from an unexpected source, one of the women from the estate, speaking through words she had written months ago, waiting for someone to find them. Inspector Calloway spent the next week conducting interviews throughout Montgomery. He spoke with the auctioneer who had sold the 7 women to Elijah, with merchants who had supplied the estate over the past year, with neighbors whose property bordered Thornhill land, and with members of the 5 families whose names appeared repeatedly in connection to the 1836 fire. The auctioneer, a heavy, set man named Porter Williams, remembered the transaction clearly. Never seen anything like it. Williams said, sitting in his office above a tobacco shop. Man comes in, looks at every woman we have available, then picks 7 specific ones and pays a premium price without negotiating. Usually, buyers want to haggle, especially for that many at once. But Mr. Thornhill just counted out the money and asked for immediate transfer of ownership, had a wagon waiting outside. Did he explain why he wanted those particular women? Williams shook his head, didn't ask, frankly, didn't care. A sale's a sale, though I did notice he spent a long time talking to each of them before making his decision. Asked them questions about their history, where they'd worked, who their families were. Most buyers don't bother with that kind of detail. Did the women seem afraid of him? No more than they were afraid of everyone else. They were being sold, Inspector. Fear was the primary emotion in that room, regardless of who was buying. The merchants provided similar stories. Elijah had been a regular customer since the previous February, purchasing supplies in quantities that suggested he was finally putting his land to use: flour, sugar, salt, lamp oil, fabric, tools, seeds. Nothing unusual except the quantities, which were larger than needed for 8 people, but not suspiciously so. The neighbors were less helpful. The nearest property was 3 quarters of a mile away, owned by a farmer named Douglas Pritchard, who grew tobacco and raised hogs. "Don't see much from over there," Pritchard said. "The trees are too thick, and I mind my own business. Heard he married one of his slaves, which is his affair, not mine. Haven't heard any screaming or seen anything suspicious, if that's what you're asking." "You're sure?" "No unusual sounds at night." Pritchard hesitated. "Well, there was one night, maybe back in April or May. Heard something that might have been a woman crying, but it was far off. Could have been an animal. Didn't last long. Mentioned it to my wife, and she said it was probably just an owl. We let it go. The conversations with the 5 families proved most interesting, particularly because of what they refused to say. Richard Caldwell, patriarch of the Caldwell plantation, received Calloway in a drawing room that reeked of cigar smoke and old money. He was 71 years old, corpulent, and red, faced with hands that trembled slightly as he lifted a glass of whiskey to his lips. "Thornhill's a madman," Caldwell said bluntly. "Always was, even before the fire. Too intense, too focused on things that didn't matter. When his family died, it broke whatever was left of his mind. Marrying a slave woman. That's just the latest evidence of his insanity. Did you receive any of the anonymous letters about conditions at his estate?" Caldwell's expression darkened. "I received several, all of them nonsense, trying to implicate me in whatever delusions Thornhill is living under. I had nothing to do with that fire, Inspector. My property was damaged by it too. 3 barns burned when the wind shifted. And yes, some of my people escaped that night, but they were recaptured within a month. This has nothing to do with me. The letters suggest otherwise. The letters were written by abolitionists or by Thornhill himself to create sympathy. Either way, they're irrelevant. If you want to investigate a crime, investigate Thornhill's theft of property. Those women he purchased came from an estate that was settled fraudulently. There are liens against that sale that were never resolved. It was a deflection, obvious and clumsy, but it revealed something. Caldwell was worried. Calloway filed that information away and moved on to the next family. The pattern repeated with the Harpers, Suttons, Bradfords, and Reynoldses. All had received anonymous letters, all dismissed them as malicious lies, all insisted they had no connection to Elijah Thornyhill beyond the tangential relationship created by the 1836 fire, and all of them, without exception, seemed anxious to end the conversations as quickly as possible. On the 8th day of his investigation, Calloway received a message at his hotel. It was delivered by a young black boy, perhaps 10 years old, who handed him a folded piece of paper and ran away before Calloway could ask any questions. The note was written in careful, educated handwriting. If you want to understand what is happening at the Thornhill estate, examine the property records for the 5 families. Pay special attention to transfers that occurred in late 1836 and early 1837. Truth is hidden in plain sight. Calloway returned to the clerk's office and requested all property records for 5 families covering the period from November 1836 through June 1837. David Patterson brought out 3 thick ledgers and spread them across a reading table. "This will take a while," Patterson said. "These families own substantial holdings." "What exactly are you looking for?" "I'll know when I see it," Calloway said. He worked through the afternoon and into the evening until Patterson had to light lamps to continue. The records were dense and difficult to parse, filled with legal language and abbreviations that required Patterson's help to understand. But slowly, a pattern emerged. In the 6 months following the fire, all 5 families had conducted significant property transfers. The Caldwells had sold 3 enslaved people to a plantation in Georgia. The Harpers had sold 5 to a buyer in Louisiana. The Suttons, Bradfords, and Reynoldses had conducted similar transactions, each selling or transferring small numbers of enslaved people to distant locations. Individually, the transactions were unremarkable. Plantation families bought and sold slaves regularly, often for financial reasons or to break up families as punishment. But taken together, the pattern suggested something else. The 5 families had been systematically removing specific people from their properties and sending them where they couldn't be questioned about what had happened the night of the fire. Calloway made a list of names from the transfer documents. They cross-referenced them with the names in Elijah's journals, which he had retrieved from the estate during his first visit. The overlap was striking. Nearly every person the 5 families had sold or transferred in early 1837 appeared somewhere in Elijah's meticulous research notes, but there was more. Among the names were family relationships that connected back to the 7 women Elijah had purchased in 1852. Hannah's mother had been owned by the Caldwells and transferred to Georgia in January 1837. Ruth's grandmother had worked for the Harpers and been sold to Louisiana. Lee, Denina, Judith, Naomi, and Rebecca all had similar connections, familial links to people who had been present on or near the properties the night of the fire and then quickly removed. Elijah hadn't chosen these 7 women randomly. He had selected them because of who their families were, because of what those families might have known about the events of November 3, 1836. The next morning, Calloway returned to the Thornhill estate unannounced. Elijah was working in the vegetable garden, tying up tomato plants with strips of cloth. He looked up as Calloway approached, but didn't stop working. "Back so soon, Inspector. I thought our business was concluded." "I'd like to see your journals," Calloway said, "the ones you kept during your 15 years of isolation." Elijah straightened slowly, wiping soil from his hands. "My journals are private property, Inspector. You have no legal right to them." "I'm not asking for a right. I'm asking for cooperation. Unless you'd prefer I return with federal marshals and a warrant that allows me to search every inch of this property." The threat hung in the air between them. Elijah studied Calloway's face for a long moment, then nodded toward the house. "Come inside." The study was on the 2nd floor, a small room with a single window overlooking the backyard. Shelves lined 3 walls, filled with ledgers, journals, and loose papers organized in stacks tied with string. A desk sat beneath the window, its surface covered with maps of Montgomery County and the surrounding region. Elijah pulled a wooden chair away from the desk and gestured for Calloway to sit. "These are 15 years of my life," Elijah said quietly, running his hand along one shelf. "Every day documented, every detail recorded. What exactly do you hope to find?" "The truth about why you bought those 7 women." Elijah selected 3 journals from the shelf and placed them on the desk. "Then read, Inspector, but understand that what you find won't change anything. I've broken no laws." Calloway opened the first journal and began to read. The entries started in late November 1036, just days after the fire. The handwriting was shaky at first, the words of a man in acute grief. "Margaret is gone, Emily is gone, Catherine is gone, the house is ash. I have nothing left but questions and the need for answers." The entries that followed chronicled Elijah's descent into obsession. He had hired investigators, interviewed witnesses, and spent weeks reconstructing the events of that night. The escape from the Caldwell plantation had been planned for months. Coordinated by an unknown organizer who had connections throughout the network of plantations in Montgomery County, the fire at Elijah's house had not been an accident or collateral damage. It had been deliberate, set by someone who knew the layout of his property and understood that the fire would serve as a distraction while the escapees made their way north, but who had set it. The investigators had found no clear evidence, and the Caldwell family had pressured authorities to close the case quickly. Too many questions about the escape might reveal uncomfortable truths about security on their own plantation, about the possibility that some of their trusted workers had been planning rebellion. Elijah's journals showed that he had continued investigating long after official channels had given up. He had spent months, then years, tracking down anyone who might have information. He had interviewed field workers, house servants, overseers, and free black residents of Montgomery who might have heard rumors. Slowly, painfully, he had assembled a picture of what had happened. The escape had been organized by a network that included both enslaved people and free black residents of the area. The fire at Elijah's house had been set by 3 individuals, 2 men and 1 woman, all of whom had worked on properties belonging to the 5 families. The woman had worked in the Caldwell house, 1 man had been employed by the Harpers, the other had belonged to the Reynolds family. All 3 had escaped that night and were never recaptured, but Elijah had learned their names, Samuel, Marcus, and Dinah. And more importantly, he had learned the names of their family members who remained in the area. People who might have known about the plan, who might have helped, who carried the guilt of what had been done to his family. See you again.